Good evening, NABJ and guests. Thank you for joining us for The Legacy of the Enslaved, Far Beyond One Family Story. We are here tonight to explore how the legacy of the enslaved provides historical context for the resiliency and determination of African Americans in U.S. history. The transcendence of the Black Lives Movement in 2020 and the poignancy of walking in our ancestors' footsteps. And we're doing this in the context of Betty Kearse's memoir, The Other Madisons, The Lost History of a President's Black Family, that traces 8 generations and tells the story of their struggles, perseverance, and contributions, from her enslaved ancestors to her relatives today, and the documentary her book inspired. To get started, we'd like to find out what brought you to this evening's webinar. We'll be posting some polling questions, so please answer the questions you see on your screen now. The first is, what brought you to this webinar? And the second is, how much do you know about your enslaved ancestors? While we're waiting, you'll see bios for our participants in the chat room. We'll be using the chat for information, websites, and that sort of thing. You'll be using the Q&A for actual questions to us. All right, do we have the poll results? Okay. What brought you to this webinar? We have the majority is interested in learning more about slavery in the US, which is 53%. Interest in exploring my ancestral roots is 47%. Curiosity about Madison's Black descendants, 38%. How much do you know about your enslaved ancestors? We have a majority, 44, or a plurality really, 44% with who know nothing, 34% know some, and 22% know quite a bit. So thank you. Now that we know something about you, our panelists will tell you something about themselves, starting with Betty Kearse, author of The Other Madisons. Betty, tell us a little bit about yourself and about your book. You're muted, Betty.
Thank you. I was a pediatrician for more than 30 years, and I loved it. But I just knew that my life's purpose was something else. And I had the sense that that purpose had something to do with my growing up hearing, reciting, and trying to live up to my family's credo, which is always remember, you're a Madison, you come from African slaves and a president. In 1990, when my mother turned over to me the old cardboard box of family memorabilia, I became my family's 8th generation griot, which means I became our oral historian. When I asked my mom why now, she answered, I want to give you plenty of time to write the book. To write the book, I decided I needed to try to understand what that credo was really saying. And to understand what the credo was saying, I wanted to understand my ancestors, both white and Black. And to get to know my ancestors, I decided to go on a journey of discovery. So I went to Lagos, Portugal, where the transatlantic slave trade began, to Ghana, West Africa, where my family's first African ancestor in America, and who was also my family's first griot, was born. She was born in Ghana. I went to Baltimore, Maryland, to get a sense of what my enslaved ancestors had endured during the Middle Passage. I went to New York City, where an 18th century African burial ground had recently been discovered because I was interested in the burial practices of enslaved people. And I went to Central Texas, where my great-great-grandparents and their 8 sons learned that they were free. But my journeys really began and ended at Montpelier, where the labor of 3 generations of my enslaved ancestors enabled a man to become the 4th president of the United States.
All right, and Betty, let me cut you off. We'll come back to you, and you can elaborate on wherever it was that you were going with that. Let me go to Dr. Shelley Viola Murphy. Could you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, and thank you for having me. I've been a genealogist for over 30 some years and got the notion actually from my mother. And currently I'm a coordinator and an instructor for the Midwest African American Genealogy Institute and a panelist with Black Pro Gen. And I've put those links also in the chat. My current job is working for the University of Virginia, where I am finding the descendants of the enslaved laborers that built that university, basically starting with Thomas Jefferson. So that's somewhat my research journey and where I'm at right now. And I do a lot of presentations and things across the country.
Okay, our third panelist, Eduardo, I believe is not with us yet. Is that true?
That's correct.
All right, when he's able to join us, we'll come back to him for his introduction. But we're going to move on with some of the other questions. I want to ask Betty first how you became aware of your ancestor's story to begin with, and describe your lineage and exact ties to James Madison.
I was about 5 years old when I learned from my mother that I am a descendant of President James Madison and one of his enslaved cooks, who's known as, her name was Corinne. And what was the other part of your question?
What's your exact lineage from that point on? And what is your tie to James Madison?
Okay, so President Madison was my great-great-great-great-grandfather, four greats.
Okay, and give us the generations in between them, from Colleen to you.
Okay, so Corinne and President Madison were my 4 greats grandparents, and they had a son whose name was Jim. And so Jim was my great-great-great-grandfather, but he was sold and ended up in Tennessee. So he went from Virginia to Tennessee through a sale. And from there, he had a wife, and they had at least one son who was my great-great-grandfather, Emmanuel. And Emmanuel and his wife had at least 8 children, one of whom was my great-grandfather, Mac, and my grandfather, John Chester, and then my mother, and then me, and then my daughter and my great-grandchildren. And my grandchildren, I don't have any great-grandchildren, my grandchildren.
All right. Dr. Murphy, you said that your mother got you started on genealogy. Could you elaborate on exactly how you started and what you found in your initial work?
Yes, well, she always told about her grandmother, stories that her grandmother always talked about time in the past. And so that was interesting to me. And then she mentioned her great grandfather was a slave. And I was like, what? Wait a minute. What do you mean? And so that piqued the interest. And that was back in the 70s. And so it took off from there. So I started, just like everybody else, started pulling records, helping her. You know, we didn't have the online at that point. So I had to go to courthouses, go to the cemeteries, which we still need to do today. And so other than that is just learning and listening and attending any educational opportunity that I could to be able to gain more knowledge and some skills.
Okay, where did you find out that he was enslaved, and what was his story?
Oh, in Virginia.
Of course.
Yeah, in Virginia. He somewhere was enslaved around Jefferson County, Virginia, which is now Jefferson County, West Virginia. And not too far from Harper's Ferry. It's all in the same county. And his name was George Marsh. And so he married my second great grandmother.
Great. Betty, talk to us about why it took you so long to write The Other Madisons. I believe it was 30 years.
It was 30 years. A lot of reasons. One is that I had incredible material to work with. So this box of family memorabilia had so much in it. I didn't know how best to represent it. So when my mother asked me to write a book, she really meant for me to just write down the family stories. But there's much, much more, behind the stories, the histories that many African Americans share. And so then I wrote it as a novel so that my ancestors could, as fictionalized characters, could speak for others. And then it turned out really that the best way was for me to put myself in the story and write a memoir. So that was one reason. The research itself, like I mentioned, the travels took time, and then all the obstacles, which I'm sure Dr. Murphy can tell you about, the obstacles that African Americans have to deal with when they're researching their genealogy. And then, I just had to grow, my personal growth. I had been kind of a protected, sheltered child, and I just had to grow in order to really deal with what was in these stories, what my ancestors had experienced.
Good. One of the things that you talk about in the film is that basically the institution of slavery and the fact that Madison's family purported to own people allowed him to get the education he did and to become the person he was. And that education informed him in his philosophies and his knowledge of government, and therefore allowed him to contribute to the nation. I'd like you to talk a little bit about how important James Madison was, not just as a president, but as a founder and as one of the people who formulated the ideas of the Constitution and the nation.
Well, because James Madison and his family owned some 300 people, he had the luxury of study, of scholarship. So he had private tutors while the slaves were doing all the hard day-to-day work, that has to be done just to get by. Then he was able, because he had enslaved people taking care of all his needs. In fact, when he went off to the College of New Jersey, which became Princeton, he took a slave with him, who took care of him. So he had the luxury of thinking and spending a lot of time studying political philosophies that then informed the foundation of the Constitution, which he brought into that convention and was very vital to the Constitution that we have today. And that is, I believe, his most important role as a founding father, even more so than his being a president, his being father of the Constitution.
Yes. Dr. Murphy, similarly, Jefferson and the University of Virginia, you're working on what who the descendants were, I assume, and what they contributed to that university, to him, to the nation. Could you talk about that a little?
Yeah, it's really they have tracked who the enslaved laborers were that were rented to the university. So the professors were allowed to have their enslaved folks on the grounds of the university. The students were not allowed. So basically, I'm given a list that was tracked and built from the financial records, wherever money was spent on labor and who got paid for that. So I basically get a list with the slaveholder name, the enslaved person's name, or a first name only, or, a group of slaves were there. And so I am looking for the descendants of those enslaved. So having a name or a first name, whatever it is, then I'm coming forward tracking, trying to find the descendants. They put up $11 million memorial to the enslaved laborers on the grounds of the university, and to honor and to memorialize these laborers and the work that they have done, which this is across the country, where buildings that are built in this country are built. But I have to give kudos to the university to put this work in, and to reach out and use the community to help, to find the names of the descendants, because there's people that don't know that their ancestors were the brickmaker or the carpenter, or and so on.
Great. All right. I see that our filmmaker has joined us, Eduardo Montes Bradley. Let's bring him into the conversation. Eduardo, I had everybody else describe who they were briefly and a little bit about your work, this film in particular, and if you want a little bit about your other films. Your bio is in the chat room, but go ahead. You're muted. You're still muted.
I think that now I'm okay, right?
Yes, should be.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and my apologies for being late. I'm a filmmaker, as you well stated before, and that's all I did all my life since junior high school, and all I ever did is films, documentary films. In the past 20 years, mostly focused in the African American experience in the Americas. The United States, Mexico, Cuba, Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia. There are Afro-Brazilians, Afro-Bolivians, Afro-Cubans, and mostly, and in the last 10 years, I would say, since I first started working on a biographical film with Julian Bond, I stayed with the African-American subject and the African-American experience. It was a pleasure for me to team up with author Betty Kirst to tell the story of her ancestors. and the descendants of mixed race descendants of an American president and his father, and a slave woman called Mandy and Corinne. I think that summarizes who I am and why I'm here.
Okay, and how exactly were you attracted to Betty's story, or how did you learn of it to even make a film about it?
I've been involved with James Madison's Montpelier for quite a while now. I did all of the photographic documentaries and portraiture of the descendants at Montpelier, who are an intrinsic part of the exhibit called the Mere Distinction of Color that was nationally recognized and awarded. And I met Betty in James Madison Montpelier during one of the Juneteenth celebrations. We talked about her book. I had an opportunity to read it, and I said, well, there's a movie here to be made.
Great. Back to Betty. Let's talk about, why was it important for you to write this book, and what do you hope that people will take away from it?
It was important to write the book because I felt that the time had come for my family's story to be part of America's story. And it was also important to preserve the stories in writing, because as my family got farther and farther away from the hardships of slavery and Jim Crow, there was an increasing risk that our family would just become too comfortable and forget, our family history. And what I want readers to take away from the book is that enslaved people were remarkable individuals. And this is in the movie, but I just can't say it enough, that these remarkable people had inner strength and a sense of hope by which they survived, and many, many talents by which they contributed to America. And especially important to African American readers and their children is that when slave people died, they did not take those qualities with them to the grave. Instead, they passed them on to those of us alive today. And that's the message I especially want the young people to get.
Okay. I understand we have a lot of questions building up in the Q&A, and we're not quite halfway through, but I'm going to let us go to their questions, and then if I still have questions, I'll come back to mine. Let's see what we have. Our first person wants to know whether Betty has connected with members of the James Madison family.
I have met several members, some of whom have sort of welcomed me into the family, and others of whom are quite distant. But yes, I have met a number of recognized Madisons, that is the white family.
Great. Okay, for for Betty again. How did you research your lineage beyond the oral history?
I actually think that's a better question for Dr. Murphy, because I know I went to old newspapers, I went to courthouses, I used Ancestry.com, but this is really Dr. Murphy's area of expertise. And I think more broadly helpful to the audience.
I think the question was, what did you do? Personally, what did you do beyond knowing the oral history? And then I'll ask her too.
Okay. looking at census records. And, I discovered, or with the help of some of my cousins who were also interested in our family history, and, discovered an emancipated Black man whose name is Shadrach Madison, who actually might be an ancestor. And I mentioned, and I know that I am related to him and his descendants. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned newspapers. What else did I do? I went to courthouses. I went to the Orange County courthouses and looked through microfiches, which is very tedious, but I did that. I did a lot of research with the help of the staff at Montpelier, especially with their historians and archaeologists. I called family members to see what documents they had that they would share. I could go on.
Okay. Dr. Murphy, you can help us here. What, in general, what are some of the challenges and resources available, particularly to African Americans? And you mentioned free people of color, how that might be different. Could you speak to those questions?
Sure. Well, one of the things folks can realize is that genealogy research is really about time, place, and asking questions. And you can hear some of what Betty said, I went here or I went there. So she went there with questions to find answers. So folks should start with what they know first and write down everything they've ever heard or they know about that ancestor, be free or if they were enslaved. You also want to find out what records and resources are available in that local area where your ancestors are from. Courthouse, public libraries, historical societies. Are there any genealogy groups? Go to the churches. Is there any histories on the churches? Are there records there? And you go from there through generation and generation. You can start with yourself, which is typical, or start with your grandmother or someone there that would show up possibly in that last 1940 census and work your way backward. Same way I do the approach looking for the descendants. I'm going back and forth. I go back in time for when they were enslaved to find where they're at. And know that the challenges for African American and actually free people of color are going to come. Just expect them. Don't try to avoid them because you're going to have them. African Americans that were enslaved were property. Don't go look in the census record for them. They're not going to be there. Go where it's logical and it makes sense. The property records are where there's going to be money and there's records for buying and selling. And that includes our ancestors who were enslaved. If people were free, they're not going to be in that record. They're going to be listed on the census record. And there's other and numerous records and resources available for people to go through to research for their ancestors.
That was the next question, was how were you going about finding the descendants? And also there's another question related. Are the descendants willing to come forward and identify family members, I guess, if they know of them?
The ones that know, they're coming forth, and the ones that find out are moved. It's an emotional experience for a lot of folks to know, especially the ones here locally that walk by that university or go by that university daily per se, and never knew that their ancestors walked those grounds. So it has been very positive for me so far, and I've been doing this a year and a half. Research in the slave era research is a little different than just tracking back your family, because you're going to tap into different records and you're going to have to have a different mindset when you're coming through, because that emotional piece is going to hit you when you start going through records and all of a sudden you see a bill of sale for a 12-year-old. Well, that 12-year-old might have been your third or fourth great grandparent. And I'm sure Betty would have seen some of these documents going through. It might not have been her direct ancestor, but other ancestors that were brought, bought and sold, from the Madisons. So I think people have to prepare themselves mentally as well as the community. This is a lot of information. This is a lot of telling of the truth and facts that are coming out.
Okay. All right. I have someone else who wants to know how do you figure out how someone was purchased or how someone might have purchased or inherited their ancestor, I guess a specific person.
Sure. Documents. Number one, enslaved individuals were passed down through the family. Could be wedding gifts, son or daughters getting married. So they take one of the slaves and hand them down. It's going to be documented. If they're selling someone, there's a bill of sale typically. Find out if there were auction blocks or the slave traders in your area. I'm close to Richmond, huge. Right here in Charlottesville, another auction area. But most of your sales happen at the plantation because not everybody was like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison.
Okay. Somebody wants to know how many enslaved laborers have been identified by the University of Virginia so far.
Currently on the wall, there's 580 listed on the wall. And I'm going to say it this way. There is room for 4,000.
Okay. All right, and another question from my friend and former colleague, E.R. Shipp, who's a professor at Morgan State. She says from her research and oral history, she believes some of her ancestors came to Georgia by way of Virginia and then to the Carolinas. In your research on the enslaved in Virginia, if you have names of enslaved people, how do you track their descendants? I would think that some of these people would have several surnames by the end of slavery.
Great question. And thank you for that. Yes, absolutely correct. People could be enslaved in one location under one name or no last name. They can grow their whole life up until after the Civil War before they take on a surname. There's a myth out there that I want to make sure people hear this. Right. The enslaved individuals, not all of them took the slaveholder's name. Right. Only about 15%. So don't automatically think our name came from a slaveholder. I know Murphy is not a name from Africa, so we can't assume that. And so you want to make sure you're tracking the land, the money, right? Where the water is at. So we're watching for migrations. Mm-hmm. You want to make sure you know that community, what laws were in place, and also follow the faith of the people. If you know your folks were church going or followed some faith, you need to go find that and track that in that community.
Right. Okay, somebody wants to know whether Betty has tested her DNA and found connections to the Madison family specifically.
No, I am still working on it. I have more work to do. Mm-hmm. I've done some, but I'm not done. I'm not finished.
Okay. Somebody asked, was it oral history where you initially found out about the Madison ancestry, or was it documents? I think we've answered that. It's a combination. Well, you originally found out from oral history and later supplemented with documents. Is that true?
Yes.
Somebody wants to know, have we lost our memory? Have we lost our ancestral names even when your culture keepers even when you culture keepers research our culture and present it to us, we no longer have an appetite for it. How do we bridge our powerful young Black men and women to embrace our history?
Well, I'll answer that. And the first thing is you need to talk to them. You need to have communication. You need to share your information with them. You need to physically allow them to experience and understand it. Nothing wrong with bringing your kids to a memorial, to see this, or to go to Alabama and see the lynching memorial or things like that. You need to educate our children so what you tell them gets handed down. Right. My children might not be totally interested in it, But if we call out somebody's name or some situation, they can recall that they were told that either by me, their grandmother, or something like that.
Okay. And finally, a question for Eduardo Montes Bradley. What inspired you to focus your films on social conflicts and social justice?
Eduardo, you're muted.
You're muted. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Here we go. Partially, the fact that I am not personally invested in finding individual roots. I'm more interested in the cultural genocide of the African Americans over a period of 2.5 centuries, 3 centuries, and that is accomplished one story at a time. And just like Betty and I work together on this lineage, descendants from Madison. Like right now, I'm working on regaining conscience and rediscovering Black fiddlers of the 18th century, whose names have almost completely disappeared the history books. So I am concerned with the cultural genocide, which to me encompassed the entire African American experience.
Okay, that's interesting. All right, I do have a question in the chat too from social media. Someone says they traced their family's roots to Oregon, but hit a dead end when their great grandfather he learned was illegal. He learned it was illegal to be Black in Oregon at the time. Any advice on how to find relatives who are clearly trying to stay under the radar and to live? This would also apply to relatives who might have been passing someplace else besides Oregon. Could you answer that?
Is
it for me to
Dr. Murphy?
I didn't know who you wanted to answer.
I think it's.
Go ahead, Betty.
No, I think that's. No, because I don't think I know that. I mean, that is really a tough question when someone has kind of chosen color over family, over kinship.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
there is something I would like to add to the Oregon quest. The Oregonians are extremely well organized, and there are genealogical societies in Oregon, and everything, pretty much everything is, in fact, it's more documented, the African American experience in Oregon than it is in Virginia. I was yes, and I in fact this in the past 2.5 weeks, I hit a jackpot that I was looking for in Oregon, and I'm heading to the West Coast in the next 2 months. Right now, I'm just trying to raise funds that we need for this film. And as soon as that is done, I'm heading to Oregon to follow in the footsteps of these fiddlers from Tennessee that moved to Oregon. And everything is documented there. It's just extraordinary. I found burial grounds and graveyards, cemeteries, and marriage license, and there's a lot of information in Oregon. So whomever is looking for information in Oregon, keep going. Okay.
We're also asked to have you, Eduardo, put your website and social media in the chat. I'm going to see if there seems to be one more question in the Q&A. So this is from E.R. Ship again, who said that she was disappointed that the Friedman's Bureau records do not cover so much of Georgia, her home state. Can you discuss how useful such large collections are to most researchers, the Friedman's Bureau, Friedman's Bank, etc.?
Well, I'm sorry to hear that she feels that way, because that would be my number one reference that I would send people to if they're conducting enslaved era research. Mm-hmm. And one of the factors about Georgia, you have to know where those field offices were set up. And for folks that don't know what the Friedman Bureau record is, that's the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. It's a federal record collection. The refugees are white people. The freedmen are the formerly enslaved, and abandoned lands were lands that were owned and being leased out, and etc. The big factor for this record collection and other record collections like the Friedman Bureau is because this is right after the Civil War. This is where the formerly enslaved folks are told to go to obtain services. I like to call that the beginnings of our social services is the Friedman Bureau field offices. This is where people can access for food, and they call them ration records. This is where you walk up and you say, my name is Shelley, and this is Eduardo. We are husband and wife. We've been living together for the last 10 years. Here's the names of our children, and this is who we were enslaved by. These are the type records that are in that collection. They also provided services to help transportation. If I come to the field office and I said, my children and wife were sold and they went to Georgia, they're going to give them money and make that transportation happen. They also help the military, the USCTs, the United States Colored Troops. It is one of the most valuable documents from 1865, our collection from 1865 to 1872. A lot of people will jump right to the 1870 census and go find their folk because their names that they took and acquired is going to be there. But you know what? They're also in 1865 to 1872, and it will tell you if there was a previous name before. Valuable collection. So I hope people will use it.
Okay, somebody in the chat, Angela Walton, says that you can also find the field offices. One can use the website www.mappingthefreedmansbureau.com. So you want to look in the chat for that. Also, while I have Eduardo, could you talk about how you worked with Betty to do this documentary, and also what are some of the challenges of doing a documentary that was based on a book to begin with?
All right. I'd like to commence by saying that a documentary has to be a complement of the book, not a replica of the book. I'm not trying to bring the book, just like a novel is being brought into a fiction on the screen. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to build a documentary that will help, that will complement the work that was previously done by Betty. And then that brings me to the challenge. The challenge is that there are no images. There are no photographic record, film records. So you have to reinterpret images, paintings, documents, and bring them into the screen in a way that is coherent, faithful to the story, and that will make sense to the general audience at the same time. So it is extremely challenging, especially on a film like The Other Madisons. It was very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. I see several people in the participants list I know are working on books, and we are mostly journalists assembled here. Many people are now, like me, at a mature age and looking back on life, wanting to perhaps write a memoir or a family history or some other story, maybe even a fiction story that deals with African-American history. What is your advice to people starting their genealogy search and people who may have done a great deal of research who now want to form it into a book and or a film documentary, Eduardo, if you want to weigh in, but for any of the panelists who
the question is for me, then.
Yes.
Okay, I would like to say
the
that
question is for all of you, and if Eduardo wants to answer too, then go right ahead.
Yeah, I will just I will be very brief, and then I think Shirley should be the one answering the question at length. I think that you should be courageous enough to accept what you're going to find. If you look, if you go into genealogy or family research to find the blessings of the and the great accomplishments of the past, no, in family research, you're going to find all kinds of people, and there are all kinds of circumstances, and it should be somewhat, for me, it should be somewhat personal, but you should also have a conscience that what you're doing is a way of reconstructing a social past, a common past, a tribal past that affects all of us. I'm happy when Betty is able to reconstruct her story, because when she reconstructs hers, she's reconstructing mine as well.
Okay. Anybody else want to?
Yes, I'd like to respond. One of the things I would advise people to do, regardless if they're experienced or just getting started, is to use the tool of a timeline. And folks that attend webinars and things and talks will know. And I teach this also at the the Midwest African American Genealogy Institute, and we put a link in the chat earlier. One of the things that's remarkable about a timeline is because it's in chronological order. That means everything from the birth of that ancestor or their parents and coming through time and through their children is going to be logged line by line. Everything that happened to them, every record their name shows up, what happens in the community, and so forth. So you're logging biographical information and bringing the evidence along with it. And I think that's a good way to start formulating a book by, again, what you know, and also what you don't know and what you need to seek out to know. Questions will come up. Those challenges, especially African American, you're going to have the challenges. You're going to be missing people, and not just increments, but you also might find out all the fabulous things that happened. Maybe the first time they voted, when a baby's born, whatever, marriage and things like that. So I think the use of a timeline is a good tool to help people, whatever stage they're at in their research.
Great. Betty, did you answer?
No, I was going to say, I think it depends on what kind of book you want to write, why you're writing it, and what you want to do with it. Mm-hmm. If you want to write a book to preserve your family stories, that is great. And let's just say only your family will read it. And in that case, I would really work hard on the oral history to try to bring these people alive to you and to your offspring, and do that by talking to the elders in your family, trying to find little bits of family memorabilia. It doesn't have to be a small thing; it could be a big thing, because every item that you find has a story. So, maybe it's an army insignia or an army uniform. Photographs, of course, speak volumes. And that is part of your intimate family history. Or if you want to publish a book, that's different. You want to make it more universal. So that you're going to be, exploring the themes. What is important? What important message do you want to leave your readers? Do you want to fictionalize it? Do you want to put yourself in it, and so that you can interpret these events that happened? So, a lot depends on what kind of book you want to write and whom you're writing it for.
Okay. We need to get in one last polling question. Now that you've been through this, what have you gained from attending our webinar? That question will be posted for you. And while we're doing that, there was one last question. Does the collection that you mentioned, Dr. Murphy, I believe, help trace the property that was lost to African Americans after slavery, I guess this was the question. The question disappeared from my screen while I was reading it. But the sense was between 1890 and 1949.
Not necessarily. And there's a whole nother method of being able to track land and abstracts of land, history of lands. And some things could show up back in the Friedman Bureau, but that would only be concerning those abandoned lands. And remember, that had to have been abandoned pretty much during the Civil War, and then coming back into the owner's land, or that the federal government is going to allow it to be used for a school, hospital, etc. So there's other methods and resources that you can do to track the land. In the first place I would start would be at the courthouse and find out where the records are on the history of the land that they're researching, and you should be able to go back in time.
Great. I'm waiting for the poll results. I'm going to try to get in one last question. The common thread here seems to be Virginia. And as I told you before this webinar, my entire ancestry has to do with Virginia or traces through Virginia from about the colonial period until 1920 or so. That's every line of my family, every line of my grandparents' family, every great-grandparent, et cetera, except for a couple who may have spent a little time in Mississippi. But what I always say about Virginia slavery and why it's important is Virginia invented slavery, Virginia perfected it, Virginia turned it into a major industry. Could you speak to how central Virginia is to American genealogy, as particular African-American genealogy?
Follow the money. That's, I don't even know any other way to sum it up. I mean, I know our folks endured violence and all kinds of things, those that were enslaved, and as well as they were free people, you know, so don't have the thought that free people had it easy. They did not. No. They did not. But I think it was the money that was so critical, and it was the free labor that they had control of. And it built this country. And I think the country needs to recognize this even more so now, especially during these times. But you definitely have to understand that Virginia, I don't think Virginia totally created it. I think it also came across the water and came into the colony at the time. And everybody just took advantage of it because they could. And they made the laws, they had the records. So people African Americans really cannot do research without researching the white folks that are right around with them. So that would be the last tip, is to make sure you don't just look for your family, also realize who else is around them and in that community. Great.
Betty,
just quick comment. Yes, our stories, the four of us do kind of center of Virginia, but don't forget the North.
Oh yeah.
The second largest slave market in the colonies was in Manhattan.
Manhattan, yes.
Great. Somebody said Virginia codified slavery. I think that's a proper term.
A better word.
We have our poll results though. What did you gain from attending? 78% said knowledge to trace their own ancestral roots. 50% deeper respect for the enslaved, and 41% say history I had not known. So that we are close to conclusion. We hope that our webinar inspires people to connect with their enslaved ancestors. And I want to thank everybody for taking part, for Betty Kearse, for our filmmaker, Eduardo Montes Bradley, and for Dr. Shelley Murphy, Shelley Viola Murphy at the University of Virginia. If you have questions for our panelists later, they have all posted information in the chat room. Please take advantage of that and look them up. NABJ offers many other programs throughout the year, and we'll be having our virtual convention soon, which the information for has been posted for. Does anybody have anything they need to say before we part? Eduardo?
I would like to make a comment only with regards. I think Virginia did many things, but they certainly did not invent slavery. It's been always with us since the beginning of times. But please bear in mind that slavery still remains with us today in the form of human trafficking, and that there are people being in bondage today in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in Eastern Europe even. So let's keep our eyes open and let's put things into context. Slavery has been with us from the beginning.
No,
and it still remains with us today.
I mean that somewhat facetiously. Yeah, I mean invented in the way that America practiced it, in terms of chattel slavery as practiced in the United States.
Oh yes. You're absolutely right when it comes to that. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And slavery is still very much with us. I agree with that. Anyone else?
Well, this American slavery has a couple of unique qualities. One is that it became lifetime, and the other is that it was inherited.
Yes. Which makes it different from other forms that had been practiced before that. That's what I mean when I say that. Anyone else? Dr.
I'll
Murphy?
put my contact in there if anyone has questions. And also regarding the research I do for the university, that link was in there also, because all the thoughts, questions, and challenges that I face are also being logged throughout on that Facebook page. So people are welcome to come in, ask questions, and etc.
Great. And we'd also like to thank NABJ for providing us with this forum and for gathering people, for this webinar staff that has put this together and helped us practice and get connected and stay connected throughout it, and it directed us on our way to Alexis Yancey for basically coming up with the idea for this and for facilitating everything as we went along. I've enjoyed the audience. I see a lot of great people on here, people that I know. There's people on here I've known for darn near 45 mumble years in my journalism career. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you for NABJ.
Thank you, everyone.